The news hit Cedar Ridge like a prairie fire in August fast, hot and impossible to ignore. "You hear about that mountain man?" Jake Hawkins spat tobacco juice into the brass spittoon at Murphy's saloon. His weathered face creased with amusement. "The one they call Ezra Stone." The men gathered around the bar turned their attention from their whiskey and cards. It was a slow Tuesday afternoon, and gossip was worth more than gold in a frontier town where entertainment came scarce. "What about him?" asked Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, wiping foam from his mustache. "Word is he's come down from them hills to take himself a wife." Jake paused for effect, savoring the anticipation in his audience's eyes. "And not just any wife, he's set his sights on Martha Sullivan." The reaction was immediate. Someone choked on their drink. Another man let out a low whistle. Old Pete, who'd been dozing in the corner, jerked awake at the mention of the name. Martha Sullivan. Tom Bradley shook his head in disbelief. "The seamstress, the one with the—" He made a vague gesture toward his face, unable to finish the sentence. "The very same," Jake confirmed, clearly relishing his role as bearer of shocking news. "Saw him heading into her shop this morning with my own eyes. Stayed near an hour." The saloon erupted in conversation. Martha Sullivan was known throughout Cedar Ridge, though not in the way most women hope to be known. At 32, she was considered well past marriageable age, and her plain features made plainer by a childhood bout with smallpox that left faint scars across her left cheek had long ago relegated her to the category of spinster. "Must be touched in the head," someone muttered. "Living alone up in them mountains all these years." "Maybe he's going blind," another suggested, prompting harsh laughter. But beneath the mockery lay genuine bewilderment. Ezra Stone was a mystery to the townspeople, a man who appeared perhaps twice a year for supplies, speaking to no one more than necessary. Some said he'd been a soldier in the war. Others claimed he'd killed a man back east and fled to the wilderness. The stories grew wilder with each telling, painting him as everything from a hermit saint to a dangerous madman. Meanwhile, at Henderson's general store, the women of Cedar Ridge conducted their own trial. "Martha Sullivan and the Mountain Man." "Mrs." Henderson announced to her gathering of customers, her voice carrying the weight of scandal. I could hardly believe my ears when young Sally told me. The ladies clustered closer, bonnets bobbing with excitement. Mrs. Adelaide Pritchard, the banker's wife and self-appointed arbiter of social propriety, clutched her shopping basket tighter. "That poor, deluded woman," she said, though her tone suggested more satisfaction than sympathy. "Doesn't she realize what people will say?" "Perhaps she's desperate," offered Mrs. Cooper, the minister's wife, attempting charity but failing. After all, at her age, and with her unfortunate appearance. "Desperate or not, there are limits." Mrs. Pritchard interrupted. "That man lives like an animal up in those mountains. Lord knows what he expects from a wife." The conversation might have continued in this vein, but the shop bell chimed, and Martha Sullivan herself entered. The store fell silent as suddenly as if someone had fired a gun. Martha moved through the silence with practiced dignity, her brown dress neat but plain, her hair pulled back in a simple bun that did nothing to soften her angular features. She nodded politely to the assembled women. "Good afternoon. Ladies, Mrs. Henderson. I need 2 yards of the blue calico, if you please." The women exchanged meaningful glances as Mrs. Henderson, flustered, hurried to cut the fabric. Everyone waited for someone else to speak first. Finally, Mrs. Pritchard couldn't contain herself. "Martha, dear, we heard the most extraordinary news." "Did you—" Martha's voice remained steady as she examined the fabric. "How nice that you have news to share. The town's been rather quiet lately." "About you and that mountain man." Mrs. Cooper ventured, less boldly than her companion. Martha looked up then, meeting their eyes directly. There was something different in her expression, not defiance exactly, but a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Stone, you mean yes. He paid me a visit. He had some shirts that needed mending." "Just mending, Mrs." Pritchard pressed, her voice dripping with false concern. "Among other things." Martha accepted her wrapped fabric from Mrs. Henderson. "If you'll excuse me. Ladies, I have work to finish before dark." She left them speechless, the bell chiming her exit like punctuation to an unfinished sentence. By evening, the story had spread to every corner of Cedar Ridge. At the parsonage, Reverend Cooper found himself in an unusual position as his wife related the day's events. "Perhaps I should speak to her," he mused, stroking his gray beard. "Offer counsel. This seems rather precipitous." "Precipitous?" His wife's voice rose. "It's unseemly that man hasn't set foot in church once in the 5 years since he arrived. And Martha, bless her heart, deserves better than to be the subject of such ridicule." But even as the Reverend nodded agreement, he wondered privately whether Martha Sullivan had ever truly been seen by anyone in their community. She attended church faithfully, contributed to charity drives, and helped neighboring women with their sewing when they fell ill. Yet she remained invisible, a fixture as unremarkable as the church pews or the hitching posts outside. In her small room above the seamstress shop, Martha worked late into the night. Her fingers moved steadily over the fabric, but her mind wandered to the morning's encounter. Ezra Stone had entered her shop like a force of nature, tall, broad-shouldered, his face weathered by wind and sun, but his eyes surprisingly gentle. He hadn't stammered or avoided her gaze like the few men who'd entered her shop over the years. Instead, he'd looked at her directly, as if seeing past the scars and the plainness to something else entirely. "Miss Sullivan," he'd said in a voice rough from disuse, "I've come with a proposition." She'd nearly dropped her scissors. Men like Ezra Stone didn't make propositions to women like her. "I need a wife," he'd continued, as matter of fact as if discussing the weather. "I've watched you these past years when I've come to town. You work hard. You're kind to folks who don't deserve it. You don't gossip or carry on." Martha had stood frozen, certain she'd misheard. "I've got a good cabin, clean water, plenty of game. I can provide. I'm not looking for love, had that once. Lost it. But I could offer respect, protection, partnership." He'd paused, seeming to weigh his words. "I see you, Miss Sullivan, the real you, and I think you see me too, even if we've never spoken before today." The proposition had left her breathless, not from romantic notions, but from the sheer unexpectedness of being chosen, of being seen. Now, as she finished the last seam, Martha allowed herself a small smile. Let them talk, let them mock and whisper and shake their heads. They'd been doing it for years anyway. But tomorrow, when Ezra Stone returned for his answer, she thought she might just surprise them all. The moon rose full over Cedar Ridge, casting silver light on the dusty streets and wooden buildings. In the saloon, men continued to laugh and speculate. In their homes, women discussed the scandal over their needlework. And somewhere in the mountains, a lone man prepared for a journey that would change more lives than just his own. The spark had been lit. Now all that remained was to see how far and fast the fire would spread. The war had taken everything from Ezra Stone except his life, and there were days he wasn't sure that was a kindness. He'd been barely 20 when he marched off with the 14th Pennsylvania Infantry, full of righteousness and dreams of glory. The boy who left Harrisburg in 1861 bore no resemblance to the hollow-eyed man who returned 4 years later. Gettysburg, Antietam, Chancellorsville. The names were burned into his memory like brands, each carrying its own catalog of horrors. But it wasn't the battles that broke him. It was coming home to find his wife Clara dead of fever, their infant son buried beside her. His parents, too, had succumbed to the same illness that swept through Pennsylvania in the war's final year. The farm he'd fought to return to stood empty, a monument to everything he'd lost. The neighbors whispered when they saw him. Some called it grief madness. Others said he'd left his soul on some blood-soaked battlefield. Ezra didn't correct them. He sold the farm to the first buyer, packed what little mattered into saddlebags, and headed west until he found mountains high enough and forests thick enough to swallow a man whole. For 5 years, he'd lived alone in the Colorado Rockies, building his cabin log by log, learning the rhythms of seasons unmarked by human conflict. His hands, which had once dealt death with rifle and bayonet, now set traps, tanned hides, and coaxed vegetables from the mountain soil. The nightmares still came, but less frequently. The mountains demanded too much attention for a man to live entirely in the past. He'd discovered Cedar Ridge by necessity. Even a hermit needed supplies he couldn't make or grow. The town sat a day's ride from his cabin, small enough to avoid, but large enough to provide what he needed. He kept his visits brief, speaking only when required, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed him like shadows. It was during one such visit that he first noticed Martha Sullivan. She'd been helping old Mrs. Garrett with her packages, steadying the elderly woman as she navigated the muddy street. No one else had stopped to help. They were too busy with their own affairs. But Martha had set down her own burdens without hesitation, her plain face kind as she listened to Mrs. Garrett's rambling complaints about her rheumatism. Over the months that followed, Ezra found himself watching for such moments. Martha teaching the Mexican laborers' children their letters behind the church. Martha slipping food to the stray dogs everyone else kicked aside. Martha working late into the night, her lamp the last light burning on Main Street. She reminded him of Clara. Not in appearance, Clara had been pretty as a spring morning, but in something deeper. That quiet strength, that way of seeing need and answering it without thought of recognition or reward. Meanwhile, in her room above the shop, Martha Sullivan's past was less dramatic but no less marked by loss. She'd been born Martha Jane Sullivan in St. Louis, the third daughter of a prosperous merchant. Her childhood had been comfortable, filled with piano lessons and French tutors and dreams of the handsome husband who would someday claim her. The smallpox came when she was 14. Her 2 sisters died within days of each other, their beauty no shield against the disease's ravages. Martha survived, but the fever left its marked scars across her left cheek and forehead that no amount of powder could hide. The suitors who had begun to call disappeared like smoke. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her, as if misfortune might be catching. Her father, broken by grief and bad investments, died when she was 20. Her mother followed 2 years later, leaving Martha with debts that consumed everything except her mother's sewing basket and a determination not to become anyone's charity case. She'd tried to make a life in St. Louis, but the city held too many memories, too many people who looked at her and saw only what she'd lost. So she'd headed west, following the promise of new beginnings that drew so many desperate souls. Cedar Ridge had seemed as good a place as any to stop small enough that she could build a reputation on work rather than appearance, large enough to support a seamstress. For 10 years, she'd built that life stitch by stitch. She wasn't prosperous, but she ate regularly. She wasn't respected. Exactly, but she was needed. Women might whisper about her behind their fans, but they came to her when they needed a dress altered or a torn coat mended. She'd learned to find satisfaction in small things, a perfectly straight seam, a grateful smile from a poor woman whose dress she'd repaired for free, the first wildflowers of spring. She'd even loved once, or thought she had. Robert Brennan had arrived in Cedar Ridge 3 years ago, a traveling book salesman with elegant manners and a silver tongue. He'd courted her with persistence that seemed like passion, bringing her small gifts, reading poetry in her shop while she worked. For 6 months, Martha had allowed herself to dream again, until the night she overheard him in the saloon, drunk and laughing with the other men. Course I'm courting the Sullivan woman." He'd slurred. "You seen the way she looks at me like a starving dog at a butcher's shop. Bet she'd pay me to marry her. Hell, might even do it if the price is right. Close your eyes in the dark, and one woman's much like another." The cruel laughter that followed had driven Martha into the shadows. where she'd vomited behind the livery stable until her stomach was as empty as her heart. Robert had left town a week later, confused by her sudden coldness but not interested enough to pursue the matter. That was when Martha had truly understood her place in the world. She was 32, scarred, plain, and poor. Love, real love, was a luxury reserved for the young and beautiful. The best she could hope for was to fade quietly into the background, appreciated for her usefulness, if nothing else. Until Ezra Stone walked into her shop. Now, as she lay wakeful in the darkness, Martha tried to understand what had changed. The proposal itself was shocking enough, but it was the way he'd looked at her that kept her restless, not with pity or calculation or desperate loneliness, but with recognition, as if he saw past the careful walls she'd built to something essential underneath. "I see you," he'd said, and somehow, impossibly, she believed him. In his cabin high above the valley, Ezra also lay awake. He'd made his offer. Now came the waiting. Would she accept? A practical part of him listed the reasons she should: security, protection, a home of her own. But another part, one he'd thought dead with Clara, whispered different truths. He remembered the way her hands had trembled slightly when he'd spoken, not with fear, but with something like hope, the way she'd raised her chin when he'd finished, meeting his eyes directly. "I need time to think," she'd said, her voice steady despite the flush creeping up her neck. "Fair enough," he'd replied. "I'll come back Thursday for your answer." 2 days. 2 days for her to decide, and for him to wonder if he was making the greatest mistake of his second life, or finally taking the first step toward something resembling redemption. The moon traced its path across the sky, indifferent to human hopes and fears. In Cedar Ridge, the respectable folk slept soundly in their beds, secure in their understanding of how the world worked. But in a room above a shop and a cabin in the mountains, 2 souls scarred by different battles lay awake, wondering if broken people could build something whole together. The past had shaped them, marked them, taught them to expect little from life beyond survival. But perhaps, just perhaps, the past didn't have to define the future. Thursday would come soon enough, and with it an answer that would shake Cedar Ridge to its very foundations. Thursday arrived with unseasonable warmth, the October sun burning off the morning frost early. Martha had been awake since before dawn, her hands mechanically working through the pile of mending while her mind churned like a storm-tossed sea. The shop bell chimed at exactly 10 o'clock. Ezra Stone filled the doorway, hat in hand, his presence making the small shop seem even smaller. He'd made an effort. His beard was trimmed, his clothes clean if worn, his boots scraped free of mud. The gesture touched Martha more than any flowery words could have. "Miss Sullivan," he said, nodding once. "Mr. Stone." She set aside her sewing, grateful her hands had stopped trembling sometime during the sleepless night. "Please, come in. Would you care for some coffee?" "That's kind of you." She poured from the pot she'd kept warm on the small stove, noting how he handled the delicate china cup with surprising care. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words heavy between them. Finally, Ezra set down his cup. "Before you give your answer, I reckon there's more you should know." Martha waited, her spine straight despite the urge to fidget. "I won't lie to you," he continued, his voice low and measured. "I'm not an easy man. The war left marks that don't show on the skin. Sometimes I wake up shouting. Sometimes I can't stand walls around me and have to get out under the sky. I don't talk much, and when I do, it ain't poetry." He paused, seeming to gather himself. "The cabin's sturdy but simple, no fancy fixings. The nearest neighbor is 15 miles through rough country. Come winter, we might be snowed in for weeks at a time. It's a hard life, and lonely if you're not suited to it." "And yet you're offering it to me?" Martha said softly. "I am." His eyes met hers, dark and steady. "Because I think you might be suited to it. Because I've watched you make a life out of nothing but thread and determination. Because you know what it is to be alone in a crowd, and that's worse than being alone in the mountains. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Martha felt something shift inside her chest, as if a door long rusted shut had suddenly creaked open. "You said you're not looking for love," she said carefully. "I said I'd had it once. That's the truth. But I'm not asking you to fill another woman's place. I'm asking you to make your own place, if you're willing." Martha turned to the window, watching the familiar street where she'd spent 10 years building a life that wasn't really living. Mrs. Pritchard swept past, nose in the air, deliberately avoiding looking at the shop. Two young women giggled behind their hands as they passed, no doubt sharing the latest gossip about the spinster seamstress and the wild mountain man. "Hey, Mr. Stone," she said, still facing the window. "May I ask you something?" "Ask. Why me? You could go to Denver, find a widow with children who need a father. You could find someone younger, prettier, someone who could give you sons to carry on your name." She heard him shift behind her, the floorboards creaking under his weight. "Turn around." The command was gentle but firm. Martha turned. "You think I haven't seen pretty?" he asked. "Pretty fades. Young gets old. As for sons," a shadow crossed his face. "I had a son once. Buried him with his mother. I'm not looking to replace what I lost." He stepped closer, and Martha fought the urge to retreat. "You want to know why because when Mrs. Garrett fell in the mud last spring, you ruined your best dress helping her up. Because you teach those Mexican children even though their parents can't pay you. Because you charge Mrs. Wilson half price and pretend you miscounted the yards." Martha's breath caught. She'd thought no one had noticed these small kindnesses. "Because," Ezra continued, "you've been surviving all these years when you could have given up. That takes a kind of strength I recognize. The mountains don't care about pretty. They care about endurance." The words settled into Martha's bones like heat from a fire. For the first time in years, perhaps ever, she felt truly seen. Not as the scarred spinster or the useful seamstress, but as herself, complete and whole. "I have conditions," she heard herself say. Something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of Ezra's mouth. "Figured you might. I'll need to bring my sewing supplies. All of them. It's how I make my living. And I won't be dependent." "Fair enough. I can build you a workroom. I'll want to come to town 4 times a year for supplies and to deliver work." "We'll come together. Safer that way." "And—" She hesitated, then forged ahead. "I'll need time to adjust, to know you. I won't be rushed into all the duties of a wife." Now Ezra did smile, a rusty expression that transformed his weathered face. "Miss Sullivan, I'm offering you a partnership, not purchasing property. You'll have your own room until you decide otherwise. If you ever do." The relief that flooded through her was mixed with something else, disappointment. She pushed the thought aside. "Then, Mr. Stone, I accept your proposal." The words seemed to echo in the small shop. Ezra nodded once, firmly, as if they'd concluded a business transaction, which, Martha supposed, they had. "I'll need 3 days to settle my affairs," she said, her mind already cataloging what needed doing. "Will that suit?" "It will. I'll come with a wagon Sunday morning. We can be married at the courthouse before we leave, if that's agreeable." The courthouse. Martha had assumed a church wedding, however small. Ezra's jaw tightened slightly. "I don't hold with churches anymore, but if it matters to you—" "No," Martha said quickly. "The courthouse is fine." After all, what was the point of a church wedding when the whole congregation would attend only to mock? They stood awkwardly for a moment. Two people who'd just agreed to bind their lives together but didn't know how to end a conversation. Finally, Ezra cleared his throat. "There's one more thing." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. "This is yours now, for anything you need before Sunday." Martha opened the pouch and gasped. Gold coins gleamed inside, more money than she'd seen in years. I can't. You can and you will. His tone brooked no argument. You're going to be my wife. I won't have you starting our life together wearing rags or worrying about debts. Pride warred with practicality. Practicality won. Thank you. Until Sunday, then. He set his hat on his head, touched the brim in farewell, and was gone, leaving Martha standing in a shaft of sunlight, holding a fortune in gold and wondering if she'd just made the best or worst decision of her life. The news spread faster than wildfire in a drought. Within an hour, Martha had 3 visitors. First came Mrs. Cooper, the minister's wife, her face a mask of Christian concern, barely concealing avid curiosity. "My dear, is it true? Have you really accepted that man?" "I have," Martha said calmly, continuing to sort through fabric. "But surely you must reconsider. Think of your reputation." Martha almost laughed. What reputation instead? She said, "I've thought of little else for 2 days. Mrs. Cooper, my decision is made." Next came Robert Brennan, of all people, smelling of whiskey despite the early hour. "Martha, sweet Martha," he slurred, trying for the charm that had once fooled her. "You can't mean to marry that savage. Why, everyone knows what kind of man lives alone in the wilderness. Think what he might do to you." "What he might do," Martha said coldly. "It's treat me with the respect you never showed. Good day, Mr. Brennan." She had the satisfaction of shutting the door in his shocked face. The third visitor surprised her most. Sarah Chen, the Chinese laundryman's daughter, slipped in near closing time with a small wrapped package. "My mother sends this," she said in careful English, "for luck in your new life." Inside was a beautiful silk handkerchief embroidered with symbols Martha didn't recognize. "Tell your mother I'm grateful," Martha said, touched beyond words. Sarah smiled shyly. "You taught me to read when no one else would. We remember." After Sarah left, Martha sat in the gathering darkness, fingering the delicate silk. Perhaps she'd spent so long seeing herself through the town's cruel eyes that she'd missed the other watchers, the ones who'd seen her kindness and remembered it. 3 days. 3 days to end one life and begin another. 3 days to decide what to take and what to leave behind. Martha lit her lamp and began to pack. The storm of public opinion broke over Cedar Ridge with all the fury of a summer thunderstorm. "Have you lost your mind entirely, Mrs.?" Pritchard's voice carried through the thin walls of Martha's shop, where she'd arrived with a delegation of concerned citizens. "That man is a hermit, a recluse. They say he talks to himself in the mountains. Some even say he's killed men." Martha continued folding fabric into her trunk, each movement deliberate and calm. "All soldiers have killed men, Mrs. Pritchard. That's what war is." "Don't be smart with me, young woman." The banker's wife puffed up like an angry hen. "This isn't about his war service. This is about you throwing away your life on a man who lives like an animal." "An animal with gold enough to pay his debts and buy supplies," Martha observed mildly, "which is more than half the civilized men in this town can claim." Mrs. Henderson, the shopkeeper's wife, tried a gentler approach. "Martha, dear, we're only thinking of your welfare. You've made a nice life here. You have your shop, your customers. Why throw it all away?" "A nice life." Martha finally looked up, meeting their eyes. "Is that what you call it, working 16 hours a day to barely afford bread, listening to whispers every time I walk down the street, watching mothers pull their children away as if plainness were contagious?" An uncomfortable silence fell. Even Mrs. Pritchard had the grace to look slightly ashamed. "At least here you're safe," Mrs. Cooper ventured. "In town, with people around." "Safe from what?" Martha's voice sharpened. "From kindness, from respect, from being seen as anything more than poor Martha Sullivan." She turned back to her packing. "I'll take my chances with the mountains." The delegation left soon after, muttering darkly about pride going before a fall. But the respectable women were just the beginning. That evening, As Martha worked to finish her outstanding orders, she heard a commotion outside. Robert Brennan's voice, whiskey slurred but loud, carried through the window. "Where is she? Where's my Martha?" Before she could bar the door, he'd stumbled inside, bringing the stench of saloon with him. "There you are, sweetheart," he said, attempting a winning smile that looked more like a leer. "Come to save you from yourself." "Mr. Brennan, you're drunk. Please leave." "Can't leave." He swayed closer. "Not when you're about to make such a terrible mistake. That mountain man, he's not right in the head. Martha, everyone knows it. But me, I could make you happy." The irony of it, this man who'd mocked her to his friends now claiming to be her savior, might have been funny if it weren't so pathetic. "You had your chance," Martha said coldly. "You made your feelings quite clear that night at Murphy's saloon." His face went pale, then red. "You heard that I was drunk. Didn't mean nothing by it." "You meant every word." She backed toward her scissors. "Just in case. And now you need to leave." "Can't let you go to that savage." He lunged forward, grabbing her wrist. "You're mine, Martha. Always have been. Too ugly for anyone else to want." The shop door slammed open with such force it nearly came off its hinges. Ezra Stone stood in the doorway, and, for the first time, Martha understood why people feared him. He didn't speak, didn't need to. One look at his face sent Robert stumbling backward, releasing Martha's wrist as if it burned. "I was just," Robert stammered. "Leaving," Ezra said quietly. The very softness of his voice made it more menacing. "And if I see you near Miss Sullivan again, we'll have more than words." Robert fled, tripping over his own feet in his haste to escape. Ezra turned to Martha, his expression immediately softening. "Are you hurt?" "No." She rubbed her wrist, more shaken than she wanted to admit. "How did you know to come?" "Saw him heading this way from the saloon. Figured trouble might follow." He glanced around the shop, taking in the half-packed boxes. "Maybe you should stay at the boarding house tonight. Safer." The concern in his voice warmed her more than any declaration could have. "I'll be fine. I've dealt with drunk men before." "Not as my intended. You haven't—" There was steel in his voice now. "That changes things. Some men will test boundaries just to see if I'll defend what's mine." The possessiveness should have frightened her. Instead, she felt protected. When was the last time anyone had stood up for her? "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded, then surprised her by adding, "I'll be camping outside town tonight. Anyone bothers you, fire one shot in the air. I'll hear it." Saturday brought a different kind of assault. The good Christians of Cedar Ridge made their final attempts at salvation. Reverend Cooper himself appeared at her door, Bible in hand. "Miss Sullivan, I've come to pray with you about this decision." "That's kind of you, Reverend, but unnecessary." "My child, marriage is a sacred bond. To enter it lightly, with a man who doesn't even attend church." "Did you come to pray with me when I spent Christmas alone for 10 years running?" Martha asked. "Did you concern yourself with my soul when your congregation whispered about me during services? Where was this Christian concern when I was struggling to pay for my mother's burial?" The Reverend flushed. "We all could have done more, perhaps, but now that I'm doing something you disapprove of, suddenly my soul matters." She shook her head. "I'll take my chances with a godless man who sees me over a godly community that looked through me." As word of her confrontation spread, the town's anger grew. By Saturday afternoon, Martha couldn't walk down the street without facing hostility. Women pulled their skirts aside as she passed. Men made crude jokes just loud enough for her to hear, even the children, picking up on adult attitudes. Threw small stones when she went to the well. But there were other moments, too. Sarah Chen slipped her a small cake. "For your wedding day." Old Mrs. Garrett, tottering on her cane, pressed Martha's hand and whispered, "You be happy, child. Don't mind these fools." Even Jake Hawkins, the gossip from the saloon, tipped his hat with something like respect. "Takes guts, what you're doing," he said. "That Ezra Stone, he's odd but honest. You could do worse." That night, her last in Cedar Ridge. Martha sat in her empty shop. Everything was packed except her mother's sewing basket and the dress she'd wear tomorrow, not white, which would have been mockery, but a soft gray wool she'd made herself, the finest work she'd ever done. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door cautiously, relieved to find young Tommy Martinez, one of the Mexican children she'd taught. "Señorita Martha," he said shyly, holding out a small wooden carving. "My papa made this for your new home." It was a bird, wings spread in flight. Martha's eyes burned with unshed tears. "It's beautiful. Tommy, tell your papa I'll treasure it." After the boy left, Martha held the carving up to the lamplight. A bird in flight, leaving its cage behind. Tomorrow, she would be that bird. The thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Outside, she could see a faint glow in the hills where Ezra kept his promised watch. Tomorrow they would stand before Judge Patterson and speak words that would bind them together. The town would watch and whisper and wait for her to fail. Let them wait, Martha thought. She'd spent 32 years living down to their expectations. It was time to find out what happened when she stopped trying. Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of crystalline light that made the Colorado mountains look close enough to touch. Martha stood at her window one last time, watching Cedar Ridge wake up. Soon, church bells would ring, calling the faithful to worship. She would not be among them. A knock at her door made her heart skip. But instead of Ezra, she found Catherine Wells, her former closest friend from the early days in Cedar Ridge. They hadn't spoken in 2 years, not since Catherine had married the merchant's son and risen in social standing. "Martha," Catherine said, twisting her gloved hands, "I had to come, one last time." "To save me from my foolishness?" Martha asked wearily. "To apologize," the words came out in a rush. "For these past years, for letting them convince me that your friendship would hurt my standing, for being a coward." Martha stood frozen, unprepared for this. Catherine continued, tears streaming down her perfectly powdered cheeks. "When I heard what you were doing marrying that mountain man, my first thought was how brave you are. And then I realized I haven't been your friend when you needed one most." "Catherine, no, let me finish." She pulled out a small package. "This was my grandmother's. I want you to have it for your wedding day." Inside was a delicate cameo brooch, ivory against coral. Martha's throat tightened. "I can't accept this." "You can, and you will." Catherine echoed Ezra's words unknowingly. "Consider it payment for all the times you mended my dresses for free when James was between jobs. For all the times you listened to me cry about my troubles while I ignored yours." The two women embraced, years of hurt dissolving in a moment of truth. "Be happy, Martha," Catherine whispered. "Happier than any of us who stayed safe." After Catherine left, Martha pinned the cameo to her gray dress with trembling fingers. Something old, she thought, remembering the wedding tradition. The dress itself was new. Sarah Chen's handkerchief tucked in her pocket was borrowed, and she'd sewn a piece of blue ribbon into the hem last night. The next interruption was less welcome. Mrs. Pritchard arrived with what she clearly considered the ultimate weapon, Martha's former beau from St. Louis, Dr. William Hartley, now prosperously settled in Denver. "Martha," he said, removing his expensive hat. "Adelaide Mrs. Pritchard sent word about your situation. I came as quickly as I could." Martha studied him, still handsome at 40. With silver threading through his dark hair and the prosperous belly of a successful man. This was the man who'd courted her before the smallpox, who'd promised eternal devotion and then disappeared the moment she was scarred. "William," she kept her voice neutral. "How unexpected." "I've come to offer you an alternative," he said pompously. "My wife passed last year. I find myself in need of a companion for my children. Someone sensible. Good with household management. The position would come with room and board, a respectable salary. A position, Martha interrupted. You're offering me employment. He had the grace to flush slightly. It would be more than that. In time, perhaps eventually, if things went well. You mean if I proved myself useful enough, you might overlook my face long enough to make me your second wife. The old Martha would have bitten her tongue. The new one, the one marrying Ezra Stone in an hour. Let the words fly free. William's face darkened. You always were too sharp-tongued. I'm offering you respectability. No, you're offering me servitude dressed up as charity. She moved to the door, opening it wide. I'll take honest isolation over false respectability any day. Good morning, Dr. Hartley. He left, sputtering about ungrateful women. Mrs. Pritchard, who'd been hovering outside, shot Martha a venomous look before flouncing away. The final trial came from an unexpected source, Elizabeth Stone, Ezra's sister-in-law. Martha recognized her from the daguerreotype Ezra had shown her Clara's younger sister. Come all the way from Pennsylvania. She was everything Martha wasn't: blonde, delicate, conventionally pretty despite her mourning clothes. Miss Sullivan? Her voice was soft, cultured. I'm Elizabeth Carver, Clara's sister. Martha's heart sank. Of course, Ezra's family would object. Why hadn't she expected this? I know I have no right to be here, Elizabeth continued quickly. But when I heard Ezra was marrying again, I had to come. She paused, seeming to gather courage. I want to thank you. Thank me? Martha couldn't hide her shock. For 5 years, I've worried about him up in those mountains alone. Clara would have hated that she always said Ezra needed people, even if he didn't know it. Elizabeth's eyes, the same gray as Clara's in the photograph, filled with tears. We invited him to come live with us after the war, but he said he couldn't bear it. Too many memories. Mrs. Carver, please, let me say this. Elizabeth took Martha's hands in her small ones. I don't know you, but I know my brother-in-law. He wouldn't choose lightly. If he's chosen you, there's a reason. She pressed something into Martha's palm. This was Clara's. I think she'd want you to have it. It was a simple gold band, worn thin with years of use. Martha tried to speak but couldn't find words. Be patient with him, Elizabeth whispered. The war broke something in him, and losing Clara and little James nearly finished the job. But there's still good in him, still love, if he can find his way back to it. She left as suddenly as she'd come, leaving Martha holding Clara's ring and wondering how she could possibly live up to such a legacy. The church bells began to ring, calling the town to Sunday service. Martha picked up her mother's sewing basket, the only thing besides her clothes and tools she was taking from her old life, and walked to the door. On the landing stood Ezra Stone, dressed in a clean black suit that had seen better days but fit his broad shoulders well. He looked at her gray dress, the cameo at her throat, the basket in her hands, and something shifted in his expression. You're ready. I am. He offered his arm, formally, as if they were walking into a ball instead of facing a hostile town. Martha took it, feeling the solid strength beneath the worn fabric. There's something you should know, he said as they descended the stairs. Elizabeth was here. Your sister-in-law, yes, she found me. His jaw tightened. She had no right. She had every right. Martha's voice was firm. She loves you. She wanted to meet the woman you're marrying. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what did she say? She thanked me. Martha felt him stiffen in surprise. And she gave me this. She showed him the ring. Ezra stopped walking entirely, staring at the simple band. Clara's ring, he said roughly. I told Elizabeth she should keep it. Perhaps, Martha said gently. She knew it belonged where it could be worn again. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Martha saw past his defenses to the grief that still lived there. But there was something else too, a fragile hope, like the first green shoots after a forest fire. "Martha Sullivan," he said formally. "I believe we have an appointment with Judge Patterson." They walked through the hostile town with heads high, past the staring faces and whispering voices, past the church where the congregation was gathering to pray for their souls. Someone spat as they passed. Someone else called out a crude joke. But there were other faces too, Sarah Chen watching from her father's laundry. Old Mrs. Garrett raising a trembling hand in blessing. The Mexican family standing quietly, respectful as they passed. At the courthouse, Judge Patterson waited with his clerk, both men looking uncomfortable with the duty. But the law was the law, and Ezra had paid the license fee in good gold. As Martha stood beside this scarred stranger who would be her husband, holding Clara's ring and wearing Catherine's cameo, carrying her mother's basket and Sarah's handkerchief, she realized something profound. She wasn't leaving Cedar Ridge empty-handed after all. She was carrying with her every small kindness, every moment of grace, every person who'd seen her true worth. The judge cleared his throat. "Shall we begin?" Martha looked up at Ezra, this damaged man who'd chosen her above all others, and smiled. "Yes," she said clearly. "Let's begin." The courthouse clock showed 10:30 when Judge Patterson opened his leather-bound book. Word had spread like wildfire, and the small courtroom was packed beyond capacity. It seemed half of Cedar Ridge had abandoned Sunday service to witness the spectacle of the scarred spinster marrying the mad mountain man. "Don't pay them no mind," Ezra murmured, feeling Martha tense beside him. Judge Patterson, a fair man despite the circumstances, raised his voice. "This is a legal proceeding, not a circus show. Anyone who can't maintain proper decorum will be removed." The crowd quieted, but Martha could feel their eyes boring into her back. She heard Mrs. Pritchard's stage whisper, "Look at her in that gray dress. Couldn't even pretend to be a proper bride." But when Martha glanced at Ezra, she saw only steady approval in his eyes. He'd cleaned up remarkably well. His dark suit might be worn, but it was carefully brushed, his boots polished to a shine that spoke of effort. More than that, he stood tall and solid beside her, a bulwark against the world's cruelty. "Dearly beloved," Judge Patterson began, then caught himself. This wasn't a church ceremony. He cleared his throat and started again. "We are gathered here today to witness the legal union of Ezra Matthew Stone and Martha Jane Sullivan." A titter ran through the crowd at the formality, quickly hushed by the judge's stern glance. "Mr. Stone, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." Ezra's voice carried clear and strong. No hesitation. "Miss Sullivan, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Martha felt the weight of the moment, not just the watching crowd, but the enormity of what she was doing, binding herself to a stranger, leaving everything familiar behind. Then she felt Ezra's hand brush hers, barely a touch, but somehow reassuring. "I do." "The rings, please." Ezra pulled out a simple gold band, not Clara's ring. Martha noticed with surprise, but a new one. "Thought you should have your own," he said quietly, "for her ears alone." "Not live in another's shadow?" The thoughtfulness of it made her eyes burn. She slipped Clara's ring onto his finger in return, hoping Elizabeth had been right about her sister's wishes. "By the power vested in me by the state of Colorado, I pronounce you husband and wife." A moment of silence. Then someone in the back started a slow, mocking applause. Others joined in, the sound more like judgment than celebration. Ezra turned to face the crowd, his expression dark as a gathering storm. The applause died instantly. "My wife and I thank you for your attendance," he said, his voice carrying that soft danger Martha had heard him use with Robert Brennan. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a long journey ahead." He offered Martha his arm again, and together they walked through the parting crowd. Martha kept her head high, though her cheeks burned at the comments that followed them. "Give it a month before she comes crawling back. If she survives that long, poor fool doesn't know what she's gotten herself into." Outside, Ezra's wagon waited, loaded with Martha's possessions. It was a good wagon, Martha noted with relief, sturdy and well-maintained, with a canvas cover to protect her things. 2 strong horses stood patiently in the traces. But it was the sight of who stood beside the wagon that made Martha stop short. A small crowd had gathered, not the mockers from inside, but others. Sarah Chen and her parents, the Martinez family with all 5 children, Mrs. Garrett, leaning heavily on her son's arm. Even Jake Hawkins from the saloon, looking somewhat sheepish. "We wanted to wish you well, Mrs. Stone," Sarah said, stepping forward. The new name sounded strange to Martha's ears. "And to give you these." One by one, they came forward with gifts. Not the elaborate presents a society bride might receive, but practical things, heartfelt things. The Chen family offered a bag of tea and precious spices. The Martinez children presented carefully gathered pine nuts and wild herbs. Mrs. Garrett pressed a knitted shawl into Martha's hands. "For the cold mountain nights, child." Jake Hawkins, of all people, produced a bottle of good whiskey, medicinal purposes, he said with a wink. Martha stood overwhelmed as these people, the ones she'd helped, the ones who'd seen her, truly offered their blessings. These weren't the prominent citizens of Cedar Ridge, but they were the ones who mattered. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick. "All of you." Ezra helped her onto the wagon seat, handling her with surprising gentleness. As he took up the reins, Reverend Cooper came rushing from the church, his face red with exertion. "Wait," he called. "Mrs. Stone, Martha, wait." The crowd tensed, expecting another condemnation, but the Reverend surprised them all. "I couldn't let you leave without—" He paused, catching his breath. "Without asking your forgiveness. You were right yesterday. I failed you as a Christian and as a neighbor. I pray you find with Mr. Stone the acceptance and respect we should have given freely." He raised his hand in blessing. "May the Lord watch between thee and me when we are absent one from another." Martha couldn't speak past the lump in her throat, but she nodded. Ezra touched the brim of his hat respectfully. As they drove through town, more surprises awaited. Catherine Wells stood on her porch, waving a handkerchief despite her husband's obvious disapproval. The schoolteacher, Miss Morrison, called out good luck from her window. Even some who'd mocked earlier seemed subdued now, faced with the reality of Martha actually leaving. At the town limits, Ezra pulled up the horses and turned to look back. Martha followed his gaze. Cedar Ridge spread out below them, looking smaller already, less significant. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. Martha thought of 10 years spent building a life that had never really been living, of countless nights alone with her sewing, pretending the whispers didn't hurt, of small kindnesses that had sustained her but couldn't erase the fundamental loneliness of being unseen. "No," she said firmly. "No regrets." Something shifted in Ezra's expression, relief, perhaps, or approval. He clicked to the horses, and they began the long climb into the mountains. The first hour passed in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Martha found herself studying her new husband from the corner of her eye. He handled the team expertly, choosing the path with care. His hands on the reins were scarred but gentle, and he murmured occasionally to the horses in a way that suggested a man who understood animals better than people. "The one on the left is Samson," he said suddenly, catching her observation. "The right's Delilah. Found them half-starved 3 winters back. Previous owner didn't deserve them." "They're beautiful," Martha said, meaning it. The horses were well fed now, their coats glossy with health. "They're workers," Ezra corrected, but she caught the pride in his voice. "Like us." Us, such a simple word to carry such weight. As the road climbed higher, the air grew thinner and cleaner. Pine forests closed in around them, and Martha found herself breathing deeply, as if she could wash away the stifle of Cedar Ridge with mountain air. "There," Ezra said suddenly, pointing. "That's where we're headed." Martha looked up and gasped. In a distant valley, she could see a clearing and what looked like a cabin, smoke rising from its chimney. But it was the backdrop that stole her breath, towering peaks crowned with snow. Even in October, reaching toward a sky so blue it hurt to look at. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "It's hard," Ezra warned. "Come winter, we might not see another soul for months. The wind howls something fierce, and the snow can drift higher than your head." "I'm not afraid of hard work or solitude, Mr. Stone." "Ezra," he corrected. "We're married now. Might as well use given names." "Ezra," she repeated, tasting the name. "And I'm Martha." He nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Martha." As they climbed higher still, leaving the last traces of Cedar Ridge behind, Martha felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Not happiness exactly, that would come later, maybe, if they were fortunate. But possibility, the chance to build something new. To be seen not as the scarred spinster seamstress, but simply as Martha, wife of Ezra, worker alongside him. The wedding ring caught the afternoon light as she adjusted her shawl misses. Garrett's shawl, warm with blessing. In her pocket, Sarah's handkerchief and Elizabeth's trust. On her breast, Catherine's cameo and the weight of friendship renewed. And beside her, this complicated man who'd looked past surface scars to see strength underneath. "Tell me about the cabin," she said as the wagon rolled on. "Tell me about our home." Ezra glanced at her, and this time, his smile was real. "Well," he began, "first thing you should know is the roof leaks in the back corner when the rain comes from the east." As he talked, his voice losing some of its careful guard, Martha listened and planned and felt the first stirrings of something that might, in time, grow into belonging. Behind them. Cedar Ridge grew smaller and smaller, until it was just another speck in the vast Colorado landscape. Ahead, the mountains waited, patient and enduring as stone. The wedding might have been a spectacle for others' entertainment, but this journey into a new life, this was theirs alone. The sun was setting by the time they reached the cabin, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold. Martha's first impression was of solid permanence. Logs fitted so tightly she couldn't see daylight between them. A stone chimney that rose straight and true. A porch that wrapped around two sides offering protection from weather. "It's not much," Ezra said, a note of uncertainty creeping into his voice. "It's sturdy," Martha replied, understanding his anxiety. "Well built, that matters more than fancy." He helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering on her waist a moment longer than necessary before he stepped back, almost shy now that they were truly alone. "I'll show you inside first, then tend the horses." The door opened on leather hinges, revealing a main room that served as kitchen, dining, and living space. Everything was clean but sparse, a table and two chairs, a rocking chair by the fireplace, shelves lined with preserves and supplies. The floor was wood plank, swept clean, with a bearskin rug before the hearth. "Your room's through there." Ezra indicated a door to the left. "Mine's opposite. There's a loft for storage, and a root cellar below." Martha noticed he'd said, "your room," not "our room," keeping his promise of time and space. She moved to the doorway and peered inside. A narrow bed with a quilt that looked handmade, a small dresser, hooks on the wall for clothes. Clean, simple, waiting. "It's perfect," she said, meaning it. Relief flickered across his face. "I'll bring your things in. There's stew on the stove, been simmering all day. Wasn't sure when we'd arrive." While he unloaded the wagon, Martha explored her new domain. The kitchen area was well equipped with cast-iron pots, good knives, basic dishes. She lifted the lid on the stew, inhaling the rich scent of venison and vegetables. Her stomach reminded her they'd eaten nothing since dawn. She found bowls, spoons, sliced the bread that sat wrapped on the counter. By the time Ezra finished with the horses and her belongings, she had the table set and coffee brewing. He stopped in the doorway, seeming surprised. "You didn't have to?" "We both need to eat," Martha said practically. "Sit." They ate in silence at first, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the wind beginning to pick up outside. The stew was good, better than she'd expected from a man living alone. "Who taught you to cook?" she asked. "Necessity." He broke off a piece of bread. "Man learns or starves up here. Clara taught me the basics before." He trailed off. "You can speak of her," Martha said gently. "She was your wife, part of your life. I won't pretend she didn't exist." Ezra looked at her then, really looked at her. "Most women wouldn't be so understanding." "I'm not most women." She allowed herself a small smile. "I thought we'd established that." That surprised a short laugh from him, rusty but genuine. "No, Martha Stone, you surely are not." Hearing her new name sent an unexpected shiver through her. Martha Stone. No longer the Sullivan spinster, but something new. After supper, they worked together to clear the dishes. Ezra showed her where things belonged, the rhythm of his household. Everything had its place. She noticed. Everything served a purpose. "I rise early," he said as they finished. "Usually before dawn. Coffee's always on by first light. I trap in the morning, work the property afternoons. Sundays I rest, mostly. Read, mend harness, such like." "I'm used to early rising," Martha assured him. "Where would be best for my sewing work, I'll need good light." "Been thinking on that." He looked almost eager. "Come see." He led her to what she'd taken for a storage room off the main area. Inside, to her amazement, was a space already partially prepared, a table beneath a south-facing window, shelves along one wall, even a comfortable chair. "Figured you'd need a workroom," he said, watching her reaction. "Window gives the best light midday through afternoon. I can build more shelves, whatever you need." Martha touched the table, smooth under her fingers, and felt her eyes burn. In 10 years at Cedar Ridge, no one had ever made space specifically for her. "Thank you," she managed. "It's thoughtful." "You said you wouldn't be dependent. Can't work without proper space." He shifted, uncomfortable with gratitude. "I'll leave you to settle in." Alone in her new room, Martha unpacked slowly, her few dresses on the hooks, her mother's sewing basket on the dresser, Tommy's carved bird on the windowsill. The room was small but felt spacious after her cramped quarters above the shop. She changed into her nightgown and wrapper, then sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the day's events. This morning she'd been Martha Sullivan, town spinster. Tonight she was Martha Stone, wife to a man she barely knew, in a cabin miles from anywhere. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Martha, you all right?" She opened the door to find Ezra in the hallway, holding something. "Thought you might be cold." He offered a heavy wool blanket. "Mountain nights take getting used to, and—" He hesitated, then held out a cup. "Chamomile tea helps with sleep when everything's strange." The simple kindness of it, this gruff, scarred man thinking of her comfort, nearly undid her. "Thank you," she said softly. "For everything, for seeing me, for choosing me." In the lamplight, his face softened. "Might be I should thank you for being brave enough to come, for taking a chance on—" He gestured vaguely at himself. "The cabin, the whole situation." "Ezra," she said, feeling bold. "We're both taking chances, but I think we might suit each other." He nodded slowly. "I think so too. Well, good night, Martha." "Good night." She closed the door, wrapped herself in the extra blanket, and sipped the tea. It was perfectly brewed, sweetened with a touch of honey. Through the thin walls, she could hear him moving about, banking the fire. The ordinary sounds of a household settling for the night. Her wedding night, she thought with a touch of irony. Not what little girls dreamed of, no romantic declarations, no passionate embraces, just two damaged people offering each other kindness and respect and space to heal. Later, she lay in the narrow bed listening to the night sounds of her new home. Wind in the pines, so different from town noise. The settling of logs as the temperature dropped, an owl calling somewhere in the darkness. And from the other room, the steady breathing of her husband, not quite snoring, but the sound of a man who slept with one ear always listening. Once, near midnight, she heard him get up. Through her window, she saw him step onto the porch, a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky. He stood there for long minutes, still as the mountains themselves, keeping watch over something she couldn't see. A protector, she realized. Whatever demons the war had left him with. At his core, Ezra Stone was a man who stood guard, who made sure the horses were tended and the stew was ready, who thought about light for sewing and tea for sleeping. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. She'd need to learn the rhythms of this place, find her footing in this strange new life. There would be awkwardness and adjustments, mistakes and misunderstandings. But tonight, wrapped in a blanket given in kindness, in a room prepared with thought, in a house built to withstand whatever the mountains could throw at it, Martha Stone allowed herself something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The owl called again, and this time another answered from across the valley. Martha smiled in the darkness. Even here, in the wilderness, no one was truly alone. It was just a matter of listening for the right voice, waiting for the right answer. Through the wall. She heard Ezra return to his bed, the cabin settling back into quiet. Tomorrow they would begin the delicate work of building a marriage, of learning each other's ways and wounds. But tonight, they had given each other the gift of safety, of shelter, of being seen. For now, that was enough. For now, that was everything. The storm came 3 weeks into their marriage, howling down from the peaks like a living thing. Martha woke to the sound of Ezra's voice, urgent in the darkness. "Martha, I need you to help me get the animals secured." She dressed quickly, fingers fumbling with buttons in the cold. Outside, the wind nearly knocked her off her feet. Snow flew horizontally, stinging exposed skin like needles. "The horses," Ezra shouted over the gale. "Already got them in the barn, but the chickens—" Together they fought through the wind to the coop, where the birds huddled in terror. Martha had learned in these 3 weeks that Ezra kept a small flock, trading eggs with a distant neighbor for supplies. Now those chickens were in mortal danger if the coop roof gave way. "We'll move them to the barn," Ezra decided. "Can you carry the basket?" What followed was a battle against nature itself. Martha held the basket while Ezra caught the panicked birds, both of them stumbling through drifts that seemed to grow deeper by the minute. Her skirts grew heavy with snow, her fingers numb despite the gloves, but she didn't complain. This was survival, pure and simple. Once the animals were safe, they stumbled back to the cabin. Ezra barred the door against the wind and turned to Martha, who stood shivering, covered in snow and chicken feathers. "You did good," he said simply. "Real good." It was the highest praise he'd given her yet. The storm raged for 2 days. They lost themselves in a routine of keeping the fire fed, melting snow for water, checking on the animals when the wind died down enough to venture out. Martha mended clothes while Ezra carved. She'd discovered he had real talent with wood, creating useful objects and occasional whimsies. On the second night, the roof beam creaked ominously. "Is it going to hold?" Martha asked, trying to keep fear from her voice. Ezra studied the beam with a practiced eye. "Built her to last, but—" Another creak. "Best move away from that corner." They pulled their chairs closer to the fire, and that's when the stories began. Perhaps it was the enforced intimacy, or the knowledge that they might not survive if the roof gave way. But walls came down along with the snow. "Tell me about the war," Martha said quietly. Ezra's hand stilled on his carving. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, he began to speak. He told her about boys pretending to be men, about the smell of gunpowder, and worse, about holding his best friend while he died, promising to tell his sweetheart he'd been thinking of her. About the surgeon's tent where they ran out of chloroform and had to hold men down while they screamed. Came home expecting to wash it all away with Clara's love, he said, staring into the fire. But the fever had taken her and little James while I was gone. Neighbors said she called for me at the end. Martha reached out, covering his scarred hand with hers. He didn't pull away. I used to think the scars on my face were the worst thing, she said softly. But scars inside, where no one can see them, those are harder to bear. He turned his hand palm up, linking their fingers. You understand? I do. The beam creaked again, and they both looked up, but it held as they were learning to hold each other. When the storm finally broke on the third morning, they emerged to a world transformed. Snow drifted halfway up the cabin walls. Trees had fallen, blocking the trail to town, but the cabin stood strong. The animals were alive, and something fundamental had shifted between them. We'll be digging out for days, Ezra observed, but he didn't sound upset. Good thing I like the company, Martha replied, winning one of his rare smiles. It took a week to clear paths and check for damage. During that time, Martha proved herself repeatedly. When they found a deer trapped in a snowdrift, she helped free it without flinching. When the water barrel froze solid, she worked beside him to thaw it. When he wrenched his shoulder moving a fallen tree, she tended it with gentle expertise. Where'd you learn healing? He asked as she worked liniment into the sore muscle. My mother, she said hands that could create could also heal. She felt him relax under her touch. Does this hurt? No, feels good. There was something new in his voice, a warmth that made her cheeks flush. 2 weeks after the storm, they made it to town for supplies. The journey that had taken half a day in good weather took 2 days through the snow, requiring them to shelter overnight with the Nordstroms, the Norwegian family who were their nearest neighbors at 15 miles. Mrs. Stone, Greta Nordstrom exclaimed, pulling Martha into a warm embrace. We heard Ezra married, but in such weather we couldn't visit. Come, you must tell me everything. While Ezra talked timber prices with Henrik, Martha found herself in the cozy kitchen with Greta and her daughters, drinking strong coffee and sharing stories. It was the first female company she'd had since the wedding, and she hadn't realized how much she'd missed it. You're glowing, Greta observed. Mountain life agrees with you. Martha touched her cheek self-consciously. Do I look different? Like a woman who's found her place, the older woman said wisely. And maybe found more than that. Yes. That night, bedded down in the Nordstrom's loft, Martha lay listening to Ezra's breathing nearby. Not sharing a bed, they weren't there yet, but close enough to feel his warmth. Close enough to whisper in the darkness. Thank you for today, she said softly, for letting me meet your friends. They're good people, he replied. Greta's been after me for years to find a wife. She'll be insufferable now. She invited us for Christmas. Do you want to go? Martha considered. Christmas in a warm house full of laughter and children, versus Christmas alone with Ezra in their cabin. A month ago, she would have leaped at the social opportunity. Now, I think I'd rather have our first Christmas at home, she admitted. Is that all right? His hand found hers in the darkness. More than all right. When they finally reached Cedar Ridge, the town's reaction was everything Martha had expected and more. People literally stopped in the street to stare at them. Not at Ezra, he looked the same as always, perhaps a bit less grim, but at Martha, good Lord, she heard Mrs. Henderson whisper. Is that Martha Sullivan? She caught her reflection in a shop window and almost didn't recognize herself. The woman looking back stood straight and proud, her face glowing with health and purpose. Same scars, Same plain features, but transformed by something indefinable. Happiness, perhaps, or belonging. "Let them look," Ezra murmured, his hand warm on her back. "They're seeing what I saw all along." They completed their business quickly, but not before several people approached. Jake Hawkins slapped Ezra on the back and declared him the smartest man in Colorado. Sarah Chen pressed a small package of tea into Martha's hands, eyes bright with joy at her friend's transformation. Even Mrs. Cooper, the minister's wife, offered tentative congratulations, but it was Mrs. Pritchard's reaction that gave Martha the most satisfaction. The banker's wife stood frozen outside the mercantile, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish as she took in Martha's confident bearing. Her warm coat, Ezra's wedding gift, and the way the mountain man stood protective and proud beside his wife. "Good morning, Mrs. Pritchard," Martha said pleasantly. "Lovely weather we're having after the storm." The woman managed only a strangled sound in response. As they drove out of town, the wagon loaded with supplies and fabric for Martha's sewing work, Ezra chuckled a rich, rare sound that warmed Martha more than any fire. "That was worth the trip just by itself," he said. "What was—" Adelaide Pritchard, speechless. "Never thought I'd see the day." Martha laughed, feeling lighter than air. "I suppose I should feel guilty for enjoying it so much." "No," Ezra said firmly. "You should feel proud. You showed them all what you're made of. What I knew was there from the start." As the wagon climbed back into the mountains, toward home, and when had she started thinking of the cabin as home, Martha reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the mockery of her wedding day to this moment of quiet triumph. It seemed like a lifetime rather than mere weeks. That night, as they sat by the fire in companionable silence, Ezra suddenly spoke. "Clara used to say I saved her by marrying her. Her family was poor, desperate. Marriage gave her security." He stared into the flames. "But truth was, she saved me, gave me reason to come home from the war. And when I lost her, I thought I'd never have reason again." He turned to look at Martha directly. "I was wrong." Martha's heart hammered in her chest. "Ezra!" "I'm not saying it's love, not yet, but it's something good, something that might grow into love, given time and tending." "Like your vegetables," Martha said, her voice not quite steady. "Plant the seeds, tend them well, and see what grows." "Just like that," he agreed, and his smile was answer enough. Later, when Martha headed to her room, Ezra caught her hand. "Stay," he said simply. "Just to sleep, just to be close. I'm tired of walls between us." And so, on a cold December night 6 weeks after their wedding, Martha Stone lay down beside her husband for the first time, not as lovers that would come later, when trust had fully bloomed, but as partners, as companions, as two people building something precious from the ashes of their pasts. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent. Inside, the fire crackled, and two scarred hearts began the slow, sweet process of learning to beat as one. The town of Cedar Ridge would talk for years about the mountain man and his ugly wife, how she'd transformed after marriage, how he'd seen something others had missed. Some would claim it was the mountain air. Others would insist love had worked its magic. But Martha and Ezra knew the truth. It wasn't transformation, it was recognition. Two broken people recognizing strength in each other, choosing to build rather than just survive, daring to hope when the world expected them to settle. And sometimes, in this wild and lonely world, that recognition was the greatest miracle of all. Thank you so much for listening to this story of love and redemption in the Wild West. Where are you listening from today? I'd love to hear your thoughts about Martha and Ezra's journey. Please subscribe to our channel From Wild West and share your own stories of love conquering all odds in the comments below. Until next time, keep believing in the power of seeing beyond the surface to the gold that lies within.